So we have this situation with China, and I know that you have some insight as to what we should do moving forward. How should we treat China in the future?
Yeah, so I know that the response to the pandemic has a lot of people angry and upset, and rightfully so. Look, China's responsible for the global pandemic. It's not even up for question. I mean, put the origins aside. They let tens of thousands of people leave the country knowing they possibly infected, knowing that would trigger a global pandemic, and they did nothing to stop them. They delayed reporting under international health regulations, not for months or hours, or days or hours, but for weeks and months. That's time where if they had provided the information they were supposed to, and the world had known for that, everybody could have prepared for this pandemic. So, look, China's at fault here, and that's one of many reasons that we're angry at them. You've pointed to another one. They basically lied, cheated, and stolen their way to the top of the global supply chain. But now people want to do something about it. I'm sympathetic for that. I have three rules. Everybody's got ideas about how to punish China or whatever, but you got to follow my three rules. Rule number one is job one is getting this economy up and running. Nothing is more important. This is literally our Apollo 13 moment. If we do not get this economy up and running, nothing else matters, because we will have a pandemic. Not a pandemic. We already have a pandemic. We will have a depression that is worse than anything this country's experienced, maybe even going back to the 1930s. So we have to safely figure out how to get America back to work. So the number one thing I say, whatever you want to do in the short term, you can't do things that are going to interfere with rebooting our economy. That's number one. Number two is, and then I think this is really important, we need to do things that are going to get China's attention, not necessarily things that make us feel good. Lots of people have lots of ideas of all kinds of things to do that they like, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the kind of things that they would get China's attention. So for example, a lot of people say, well, we're going to have a huge stimulus package and we'll pay for it. We'll just cut defense. Well, what do you think is going to get China's attention? If we don't have ships in the Pacific, I think that sends a lot stronger message to the Chinese than whatever your messaging thing you want to do. And the third thing I think is really important is we have to prepare for the long term. You want to do things that are going to force China to change the way that it does business. So you have to do things and you have to stick to them over time. You can't just do a slap in the face. So I think regardless of what sets of measures people want to do or think they need to do or feel like they need to do, you have to do those three things, because we have to look after us first.
I saw a press conference the other day with the president, and the reporter asked him, well, where do we stand on a trade agreement with China? And President Trump said, I have no interest in talking with China right now about trade. Is that something that is a strategy of the president moving forward?
Well, I mean, the president doesn't have to talk about trade, because we already have a trade deal that is on the table. There's a lot in that trade deal that is actually very good for the United States. Including selling, food to China, which China needs to buy. I mean, this is a part of getting our economy up and running. So I do think the trade deal has got to proceed forward. There's lots of things that we can do to punish China that'll have real impact. One of the simplest one is there's something called the Global Magnitsky Act. So Magnitsky is a Russian dissident who was murdered by Putin. And what this act does is allows the United States government to go after specific individuals for human rights abuses. So we should investigate the World Trade Organization. We should investigate China. And we identify officials who are responsible for egregious acts. We can sanction them. And this has worked very effectively. We've done it to the Russians. We've done it to the Iranians. We've done it in Venezuela. And we can do it with the Chinese. And it's very targeted and very specific. And you don't need a law. Congress doesn't have to come back. We've got law. The president could just go out and do this. And those are the kind of measures that I really do think that will get the attention of Chinese officials, when their officials are banned from traveling, when essentially they can be, put in jail if they came to the United States. We can go after their assets. I think those things are actually be quite effective.
So when you say human rights offenses and that type of thing, you're not talking about just COVID-19 or coronavirus, because there's a lot of stuff that goes on in China that I don't think our viewers are aware of. So you're saying go in and find these other things, these concentration camps and whatnot that we're hearing exist.
We can do that. We can do that now under existing law. In addition to looking at abuses under COVID-19, look, if you by an act of omission or commission trigger a global pandemic and put lives in jeopardy, taking somebody's life is the most egregious violation of human rights that's possibly imaginable. So there's a lot that can be done to hold Chinese officials accountable. We should do that because they are. We should follow the law. That's what the law says.
So, sir, as we look down the road and we talk about second waves of coronavirus and other pandemics, how do we protect ourselves in the future from China doing something like this again?
Well, I think one of the things we're going to have to do is take a hard look at the World Trade Organization. Oh, sorry. hard look at the World Health Organization. We should probably take a hard look at the World Trade Organization, too. The WHO is responsible for coordinating global pandemic response. They utterly failed. They failed because of Chinese interference. We should hold them accountable. That organization needs to be reformed. And if it can't be reformed, then we're going to have to look at setting up alternative mechanisms so we can protect ourselves and our friends and our allies. The president, in threatening to pull money from the WHO, first of all, it did not impact the pandemic response because the United States had already given most of its money for the year, and only about 15% of the WHO's budget actually goes to pandemic response. So the president didn't endanger the global response in any way. What he did was he put the Chinese and the WHO on notice that we're going to take this seriously. And because he had the courage to do that, to call them out, a lot of other countries have already started to step up. So one issue, which was incredibly egregious, was the Chinese insisted that Taiwan, which was represented in the World Health Organization as an observer, was kicked out. That meant that none of their information, none of their knowledge, none of their needs could be addressed in the pandemic. Well, not just the United States, but Australia, New Zealand, and a whole number of other countries have now stood up and said to the World Health Organization, you need to add Taiwan back in. And that has completely angered the Chinese. The Chinese actually threatened to boycott Australian beef. The Chinese threatened New Zealand, and they've been threatened to other countries. But these countries, because the president set a good precedent, are standing up and demanding reforms at the World Health Organization. I think that's the kind of decisive, proactive action that this administration can take to ensure that this kind of behavior doesn't happen again.
We have about a minute left, and I hear what you're saying about fixing our economy, but something you just said about the Chinese threatening Australia and these other countries. At what point do these other countries push back, though? Because China needs them as well. Isn't that right?
Right. It does. And you know, I kind of turn this on its head. When I ask people, say, what can we do to force people not to do business in China? I flip it around and say, explain to me why people can't do business here. Let's remove all the barriers for people to do business in the United States. And the other thing is let's trade with our friends. We don't have to trade with China. There are a number of countries out there that can offer the same goods and services and capabilities at a reasonable price that are much less risky. So let's go do business with our friends. Let's reduce barriers to people doing business here. And I think that's a great alternative to doing business with the Chinese.
Lieutenant Colonel James Carafano, thank you so much for coming on today. We always appreciate having an expert to talk about things like this. And this one, I know everybody has been wondering about.
Right. Well, thanks for having me.